Hello, I'm Janet Bolitho from the Port Places project, exploring Fisherman's Bend, Docklands and Port Melbourne. This walk was prepared for Open House Melbourne's weekend, the end of July, in lockdown number 5. And I thought I'd like to share my observations and explorations with you. So this is a walk held also in the spirit of Jane Jacobs, and I'll talk about that a bit more later on. But before we set foot, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the places, the land and the waters where we'll walk today, the Bunurong Bunwurrung, and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, during lockdown, I spent some time on the south bank of the river looking at this vista, this interesting skyline. This is NewQuay in Docklands, a place perhaps not that familiar to many Melburnians, apart from the many people who live there. But this was a precinct that has been developed by MAB, the company formed by brothers Michael and Andrew Buxton, over a period since 1997. So in less than 25 years, all this has taken shape and form. But I was intrigued as to how it's shaping up. What's it like on the ground in NewQuay? So we begin our walk here at Kawapa Tree. It's a very identifiable point on the harbour esplanade. And it seems to express the times we're in at the moment, where everything is upside down. But the work actually references a flood in Gippsland, where the floodwaters rose so high, a cow was stranded in the branches of a tree. And it's an apt and appropriate reference in this location, because this area, which was once part of the Yarra River estuary, was also prone to flooding. Now, in pre-settlement days, the floodwaters from the upper Yarra would flood over the floodplains of the delta of the Yarra richly, bringing all that material from the forested floor to the delta. And so this was an exceptionally abundant place, sometimes referred to as the Kakadu of the South. But after settlement, the floods took a different complexion. They became extremely dangerous to people and to property. Many lives were lost. And scenes such as this were observed in this part of the world. But something else about the sculpture, it's just how well observed it is. If you just look at the place where the branches meet the trunk, those beautiful folds which you may have observed on gum trees elsewhere. And it's also a theme that will run through the walk we take today of how important public art is in Docklands, and especially in the NewQuay precinct. But this is a Jane's walk. Now, for those of you who don't know Jane Jacobs, she was a tremendously influential urban advocate, thinker, but more than a thinker, she was a pounder of the footpaths. If you want to know a place, she said, you've got to get out and walk. And that's what we're going to do. And I like this photograph of her in coat and gloves, gathering with others, no doubt discussing some important urban planning issue in New York. And so too, we would meet on the harbour esplanade with coats and gloves because it's often chilly in this spot. And Jane Jacobs' ideas about the urban have been so influential that they've seeped into every part of the practice of urban planning. And many of her ideas will be reflected in what you see at the ground level of NewQuay, and are just taken for granted in some ways, although there are other ideas of hers that equally important that have perhaps that are not reflected in the Docklands we visit today. So moving along the harbour esplanade, this is all that remains of the once great Victoria Dock, one of the two great harbours of the world. All these piles representing trees that have been taken from a forest elsewhere, most likely in Gippsland, but now decaying, just these few remaining. And going to the history of Victoria Dock, it was created in the late 1880s and early 1890s following the recommendations of British engineer Sir John Coode. He'd been brought out from England by the Melbourne Harbour Trust to advise on twin problems. Firstly, the flooding that we've already referred to, which was so damaging to the early colony. And secondly, to create a harbour that would accommodate the bigger ships that were now visiting Melbourne. And this map, although it's from 1935, illustrates this well. One of Coode's audacious, staggering recommendations was to remove this bend of the Yarra River and to dig a canal to connect this part of the Yarra River to this. And this is what we know as the river today, but it is just a canal. And we're going to later come and look at this particular junction between the railway canal and the remnant course of the Yarra River. I've highlighted the precinct we're going to explore in the red. And just to get some contemporary bearings, here's Footscray Road. And we'll stop on this bridge across Footscray Road. And you can see the hard edge, angular shape and form of Victoria Dock. Now, here, this photograph shows the Victoria Dock probably at its swan song. This photograph was taken in 1969, the year the very first container ship called at Melbourne was to herald the end of Victoria Dock. But you can see nearly every berth occupied, and where we saw those timber piles, two ships berthed right there on what is now the harbour esplanade and the NewQuay promenade. And again, I've just highlighted the precinct. Now, some of you may have noticed during lockdown the return of wildlife to the city, and a colleague spotted this Nankeen night heron in just this spot during last year's lockdown. It's a beautiful bird. If you look at its feet and how they clasp that rope. And then briefly to return to this slide and see those white caps. Clean, neat and tidy, yes, but impossible for any bird to take a purchase on. So this is where we're going to enter NewQuay, into this playful doorway representing a beach ball, I believe, but you see that this is full of colour and surfaces that catch the light. And as we enter this windbreak, the mirrors on either side, a bit like those fun mirrors you see in somewhere like Luna Park. Not exaggerated like that, but just to give you that little sense that you're now entering a different world. So this is just off Footscray Road, but it takes you, it squeezes you pleasantly into another world. So there you will come out the other side at a small sort of keyhole landscape courtyard, a convenience shop on the corner, and through this passageway we make our way to the NewQuay promenade. This is one of two kiosks, I suppose you could call them, on the NewQuay promenade, but they were actually conceived as follies and named as such, and a counterpoint to the large apartment and restaurant development on the other side of the promenade. They're whimsical, they're charming, they're fun, and it was a great sadness to see that both of these kiosks are for lease, and I hope that they come to life soon. But they were the result of the work of a student design competition sponsored by MAB and RMIT, and I think these two women have gone on into distinguished architectural careers. We're just going to go back a few steps and come to Monument Park. Lots to see in this photograph. It's a small little park, you know, intimate in scale, and it's full of places to sit and explore. And if you look through the archway presented by this first sculpture, you may see a woman sitting on a ledge here outside the cafe. And so there are many, many places to just sit and pause, have a coffee. And these are the kind of details that Jane Jacobs would applaud. But what interested me most of all as I observed this space was seeing a young lad, probably 3 years old or so, with his mother, making their way from this small roadway across to the harbour esplanade. And the little boy felt free to, and his mother felt comfortable for him to part from her and explore around the Monument Park, ride through it, round it, in it. And she did not have to have any concern, as I so often see with parents saying, watch out, look out, stop, because there's no motorised traffic in this precinct at all, in this particular part of the precinct, making it a very congenial place for children to walk and to ride. And you'll see that unlike many of the towers and podiums you see in other places, this one is curved, it's colourful and light-filled. So we're going to follow up this little road here, and it's interesting, if you know, cars, you can see some cars there, they're parked cars, people can walk down it, but it's a very slow speed, slow volume a road, very narrow. And we're going to come out at the back of this development, currently under construction. It's called Escala, and it's by 6 Degrees Architects. And one of the interesting things about MAB is how they've offered opportunities for some of Melbourne's architects who've worked on a smaller scale to develop even bigger, much bigger projects, more ambitious projects, and to support them in doing that. And you'll see that this development, you know, because NewQuay is evolving, each development reflects different imperatives, different moods, different needs. And although this development was started some time ago, it anticipates the kind of needs that are emerging now in this COVID period for home offices and generous places to live and to work. And you'll see that the kind of materiality of this development is quite different from the glass that we saw earlier, warmer, more brick-like. Crossing at the lights on a further corner, came to the Docklands community garden. And it was hard to make sense of this in the lockdown days. You can see a scala there just in the background. Looking a wee bit unkempt, uncared for, but there were lots of plants in flower. The bees were buzzing. The compost smelt very fresh. There were signs that the community group meets here regularly. So clearly the community comes together around this community garden. Although this is a development site, and would such opportunities be made available in the future. And now we continue to come out at the new Docklands Primary School. One of the most persistent complaints about Docklands in the early days was how government and community infrastructure had failed to be provided. It was a long-standing bone of contention, and following extensive, long-standing advocacy, a primary school opened in NewQuay, Docklands at the beginning of this year, a school that can accommodate 525 students. Extensive consultation was undertaken with the community in the lead up to the design, and the themes were strong and recurrent. People wanted the school to function as a place to connect, a place to belong. And there was also a very strong desire for a sustainable, nature-based focus to the school. And you can see these aspirations abundantly realized in the school. Here's another photograph of it, showing those verandas, almost like little boats, or what would you call them, outside decks, almost like the deck of a ship, with the warmth of the timber. And it's a very interesting school to navigate. And at the heart of it all is a basketball court, or a common user court. And what I like most about the school is that it has a clock tower showing the time, and it's almost like you see in a medieval village, a centerpiece in this precinct, and it sort of really marks the civic and educational presence of the school in the precinct. Continuing, now I mentioned those roads that were small and narrow, but in addition to those roads, there are these covered walkways which are fully publicly accessible. And my eye was caught here by this artwork, Untitled, by Rika Rennie, the Kamilaroi artist. A very distinctive work. You'll pick it anywhere. And I love his work. And you see it foregrounds this timberline passageway, well lit, very comfortable. And recognizing that not every active street frontage can be a shop, because there are only so many shops that can succeed. The little windows off this passageway into the ground floor of the apartments above, where there's a kind of living room come library flavor to the place on the left, just to add visual interest as you walk through. So just going to the end of the passageway where you can see the light, and this is where you emerge. This gentle slope taking you to the ground level of Charles McBride Ryan's Banksia apartment building. And as you can see, it has this truly beautiful screen carved by Robert Bridgewater. And the screen represents beaded glasswort, a salt marsh plant of which I'm particularly fond. And here it is growing abundantly elsewhere. You'll see the shades of red are astonishing in their spectrum, and the beaded glasswort is quite translucent and spongy. And it says that beaded glasswort grows at nearby Moonee Ponds Creek, and so it does, but just little remnants of it. And just to give you a sense of the building itself, so poor photograph of their building, which is on the site, if any of you remember, of a very windswept, freezing in winter, hot in summer piazza that had earlier been on the site. And a very attractive feature is it's set in a small neighbourhood park, which people use well for walking dogs and so on, but lined with Banksias and other Indigenous vegetation. It's a very lovely approach to the building. So we continue on and find ourselves, perhaps surprisingly, at a townhouse development, very recognizable urban form, the individual gates, the individual entries, the transparent fences, and these townhouses are all located around another small neighborhood park. Just a bit like the London model or St. Vincent's Square, St. Vincent's Park, where you get the housing around a square. So perhaps surprising in this more high-rise precinct. And turning the corner where the no entry sign is, we come to the tram terminus. NewQuay is well served by public transport. This is the 86 service and the 75, the one to Burke Street, the other to Flinders Street. So very, very well located for public transport. And continuing towards where that pylon is, we come to the Ron Barassi Park. This is bigger than the other parks we've visited. It's a decent sized park and an exceptionally hard-working one. It has 2 soccer fields. Many people use the park for personal fitness and trainers, but it's also well used by dog walkers and particularly by children and those who care for them. It has a very beautiful playground with natural materials and Indigenous landscaping. There's sand play, there's water play, there's adventure play, as well as many places for parents to sit. So moving out of the park and near the tram terminus, we enter the district Docklands. Now, if there was any place in this precinct that had a poor reputation, it was this. But under the new owners, Ash Morgan, this shopping centre has really been transformed. As you can see, there are plants everywhere and right throughout. And there's also, it's light-filled, it's spacious, it's low-key, very attractive shopping centre with many well-known anchor tenants. But what caught my eye most of all was this basket bearing the local paper. The Docklands Authority early on realised that they wanted to stimulate a sense of community and identity, and they started a local paper. It was taken up by Shane Scanlon, a former journalist who really developed the Docklands News masthead. He became a passionate Docklands person, always advocating for Docklands issues. You would often see him at City of Melbourne meetings or quizzing state parliamentarians, because he always had the welfare of Docklands at heart. Very sadly, Shane died earlier this year, but Docklands News, Southbank News and CBD News are in the really excellent hands of the new editor, Sean Carr. We come out of the district Docklands at the Wheel, and once again, the Wheel's been a controversial part of the Melbourne skyline, but I wondered, is it time to have another look at the Wheel, to see the city from a new perspective, just a place to have fun, commodity which has been in very short supply in recent times. The Wheel at ground level is surrounded by sort of food court type tenancies. So definitely a place for a destination. And behind the Wheel is Costco's. Now, I've always only seen Costco from Footscray Road, where it offers a very hostile presentation indeed. But this is an alternative kind of open space adjacent to Costco. Again, many places to sit. It's like a hill, but with these red horizontal seating arrangements to break up the space. And once again, Costco could have just plonked a great big shed on the site, but the design aspirations for the precinct were high and they were required to come up with something better. And this is what Rush Wright have accommodated. But behind Costco, where there's even further parking, because abundant parking is provided, I came across this really beautiful urban forest, quite apparently highly designed. You can see the grasses have just been cut in the foreground, but these box ironbarks were in full flower. The trees were just alive with birds. Very beautiful landscape, and I think just not peopled at all, which is why the bird life is so abundant. But immediately next to this little park is the Moonee Ponds Creek, here viewed from the bridge across Moonee Ponds Creek. You see CityLink curving away there to the right, Phragmites, the Australian reeds on the left. And on the banks, this vegetation, quite dense, completely unkempt and uncared for, where some people are finding shelter, as they did in Dudley Flats not far away in all those years ago. And the Moonee Ponds Creek has been a much abused waterway, terribly used. It was actually in this stretch not really a creek at all, but again a constructed canal used for the purposes of conveying coal. Now, unfortunately, at present you can't walk on the creek side of the Docklands studios, but on the other side of the Docklands studios, and this is alongside the Ron Barassi Senior Oval, this concrete pathway leads straight to the Yarra River. And I found this scene sad, but also incredibly interesting, because on the left-hand side, the careful management of the landscape by the City of Melbourne, and on the right, just a weed-infested landscape reflecting the very, very complex jurisdictional arrangements that affect the Moonee Ponds Creek. And I felt quite dismal about this, the way in which this connection with the Yarra River is handled. But then, even as I was feeling so dispirited, out of the bushes on the right-hand side some activity caught my eye, and there was a family of superb blue wrens. So there on that very, very degraded bank of the Moonee Ponds Creek is this gorgeousness and this life. And so so we've got to be very careful in the management of landscapes to ensure that they're safe places for little birds such as these. We now return to the coffee shop to share notes, share observations, what we've seen, what we've heard, and just want to pay tribute to Nick at this coffee shop, who was so gracious through the lockdown in offering hospitality to people who called at the cafe. So since we can't talk together, I thought maybe you'd want to know from me what I think. So we've seen that this precinct, bounded by Footscray Road, CityLink, and the NewQuay Promenade, is actually dense with interest. It's got public transport, it's got a primary school, a supermarket, a shopping centre, several parks, attractive buildings, both at the ground level and in the air. So is there anything missing? What's happening? So since this is a precinct developed over 20 years rather than hundreds of years, it's hardly surprising that it's taking some time to develop that layering that Jane Jacobs and the intricacy that Jane Jacobs was so committed to being a feature of the vitality of cities. But nevertheless, it's various, it's not samey, you know, there's a lot of variety and interest in this precinct. And perhaps what was missing for me was just any sense of where it had come from. So with a local history background, I returned to this photograph, you know, just to compare and contrast, to understand where this whole precinct had emerged from, what the factors were that influenced its development, would be very fascinating to me. And I don't mean just in literal interpretation, you know, signs and so on, but inventive ways of telling the very interesting story of this place. So I also wondered, although there's much, much more nature being incorporated into development now, the NewQuay Promenade offers a very hard urban edge to the harbour. And it just seems that the Moonee Ponds Creek is crying out both for restoration and rehabilitation, but also to offer residents and birds and other creatures just the opportunity for a different kind of experience, more nature. So the salt marsh that was illustrated earlier, I think that the pink in this render is trying to denote areas of salt marsh and, you know, boardwalks through. And so that perhaps birds like that Nankeen night heron, the blue wrens, which are so delightful, could find a welcome home here, as well as the many people who live here. So I'm now going to conclude the presentation and say thank you very much for following on this journey with me. And I really look forward to receiving your feedback and suggestions as to how I can improve the presentation of an introduction of different places to you. Thanks so much.